As an architect and as previous head of architecture at Sheffield, I'm interested in the relationship of space and power. So I'd be fascinated to hear how, from your very privileged position in the House, you see the relationship of the spatial configuration of the House playing out in terms of parliamentary traits and behaviours, and whether you feel that spatial configuration is appropriate for a 21st century democracy of the people.
Hold on to that. It's a very simple opening question. Okay. Very highbrow in Yorkshire, you know. Very highbrow. Very highbrow.
Very upmarket.
Good evening. Thanks, Mr. Bercow. I was wondering what you thought, what your thoughts might be. Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts might be on a suggestion made, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, by Matthew Flinders himself a while ago, that the House of Parliament should be a museum, and the new House of Parliament should be moved to somewhere like Manchester or Leeds. Perhaps that would showcase the adaptability and liveliness that is espoused by Sir Bannon Crick. Thanks.
I never said that. I never said that.
Okay,
Okay, final
good
question.
debating opportunity.
Could you pass the microphone over?
Thank you. My question is about the role of the speaker, him or herself.
Okay.
The recent EU referendum has ended up with a very divided country, with a very small majority, ending up with Scotland and Northern Ireland versus England and Wales and Gibraltar, the haves versus the have-nots, the east of Sheffield versus the west of Sheffield. And a very small majority like that, once you start getting into the difficulties of negotiation, will soon slip away. And it seems to me that not having had a threshold, a proper threshold in that referendum, unlike in civic society in general, if you want to change the constitution of the university here, you'd have a 2/3, political parties, professional bodies, trade unions, but all of them would not go for a simple majority. Would you see yourself as, or would the speaker have a responsibility or a role in having suggested to the political parties that when the bill was going through Parliament, that they consider putting in a threshold because of the dangers of not having one? And did you do that?
Okay, so 3 questions. Space configuration. Was I right to even suggest Parliament should maybe leave London? And should you have possibly urged more thought to a threshold in the Brexit referendum?
Thank you very much indeed. Well, our first questioner asked about the relationship, based on his experience as an architect, between, if I remember rightly, space, physical space, and power. I think the way I would like, if I may, without being pedantic, to put it, is perhaps the relationship between space or configuration and culture. You didn't put it in these terms, but you might have in mind, and even if you don't, others might have in mind, the question, does the shape of the chamber, does the physical layout conduce to the sort of politics we want? Now here I confess, I myself am pretty trad. I am not an enthusiast for having a semicircular chamber, a kind of horseshoe. We do have a semicircular chamber called Westminster Hall, ladies and gentlemen, which is very much a subsidiary chamber, generally for debates on less high-octane matters of political contestation, although not always so, and that's a perfectly valid debating opportunity. But the main chamber is, as you know, shaped in adversarial terms. You're on one side or the other. Now, there are people who think it would be better, more modern, more consensual, more progressive to change that. I don't think the main problem in our political system is that it's adversarial. Now, sure, adversarialism sometimes becomes excessive, and it's better when it doesn't. and when you get really good non-adversarial, non-party political debates on things like the need to review the facts about the Hillsborough disaster, we all gain. The victims gain, or their families do, and truth gains, the public interest gains. When we have a great debate on mental health with a real candor and no spirit or culture of point scoring, we gain. But I think we have to accept that there are fundamental differences, in fact very sharp differences at the moment in particular, between the major parties, not just in terms of particular policies, but overarching philosophy and ethos. And that of itself isn't unhealthy. If that were very fundamentally to change, then I think possibly the question of the shape of the chamber would become more live. I don't myself think it's a particularly live issue at the moment, and I don't personally favour a changed configuration. But I'm not trying to get out of it. I've told you very clearly what I think, but I do add the rider. Though I've got modest disciplinary powers, I very well know, and woe betide me if I forget, that I'm the servant of the House. I'm not the master. It's not for me to prescribe. If the House decides otherwise, Graham Allen, for example, is a long-standing enthusiast, a Nottingham MP, long-standing enthusiast for changing the shape of the chamber. But my sense is that although Graham holds a strong view and advances it with great vigour, and on many occasions, he is in a minority. So that's my first answer. On the question of whether we should move, the short answer is, in my view, no. Why shouldn't we move to one of the big cities? I see the attraction, and I know there are lots of members of Parliament who issue press releases in support of Parliament moving, by pure coincidence, of course, to their own city. And there is much dispute. Should it be Manchester? Should it be Sheffield? Should it be Leeds? Should it be Bristol? Whatever. I think the problem is that in practice, and this is not likely to change, it would be very difficult, even with modern technology, to make it workable, because the overwhelming focus of government and the physical location of government departments is London. It's Westminster. So I think the idea that you would just shift Parliament to another city would be very difficult to work. I also think it would be extremely difficult to get agreement about where it should be. I mean, that's a second order, although an important consideration. But on the whole, I think it's a blind alley. However, it is perfectly possible to have the refurbished and renewed Parliament still in Westminster, possibly still where it is on the same site, but to say that as a matter of principle and practice, we need to improve engagement, and that has got to involve, as I said in my presentation, a much greater willingness to go out into the country, whether it be in pursuit of the gladiatorial side of politics, which still attracts a lot of interest, or whether it be select committee inquiries. I think, I may be wrong, but I think if you had serious set-piece debates with proper rules of conduct between the party leaders in big civic halls around the country, they would be full. Now, you may say, oh, John, you're completely wrong. You're totally out of touch. There would be very little interest. I don't believe it. I accept a lot of people say they don't have much interest in politics. They often don't like the shouting and the screaming and what I call the mixture of yobbery and public school twittishness. They may not like emblems of the system, but they like the substance of what politics is about. And I think they would actually respect our leaders more if, not on a stylized photo opportunity type contrived occasion, but on a more open meet, talk to and hear from the public type occasion, they were prepared to make an investment of time. Finally, in response to the question about thresholds for a referendum, did I say anything about that? I didn't. I didn't say anything about that at all. Now, you can judge me. You're absolutely entitled to say, oh, well, the Speaker should have done, if not publicly, privately, and I didn't. Why didn't I? I didn't think it was, to be honest, any part of the role of Speaker to do that. Now, it may be that I was too narrow in my thinking. Maybe if I'd known what was going to play out, I might have thought differently. I think if I'd in any very public way so much as hinted at it, it might have been criticised. I could only have done it quite gently. I could probably only have done it once, without it sounding almost rebarbative and as though I was trying to pursue a particular agenda for one side or the other in the referendum, which I think would have been politically dangerous for the Speaker. So I didn't, and even now I'm not sure that I should have done. I think the second part of my answer will be very unpopular with you and probably with quite a lot of people in the audience, but it is this. I'm not sure, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I didn't vote for Brexit. Okay? I didn't vote for Brexit. I felt that in terms of the significance of a big trade bloc of which we were a part, and in terms, in a very, very complex and interdependent world, of the significance of continued membership of an important power bloc, there was a lot to be said for remaining part of an admittedly very imperfect institution and trying to work to best advantage for us and for Europe. So that was my position, and I've no apology about that. However, I am a Democrat, and I think that the idea of a second referendum, you didn't say that, but some people do, is absolutely for the birds. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think that people who say, oh, but Mr. Bercow, I'm all in favour of democracy, but 16 and 17-year-olds couldn't vote, therefore it's illegitimate, they're wrong. Parliament considered that. I happen to be a long-time supporter of 16 and 17-year-olds voting, so I wish they had done, and the result might have been different if they did. But Parliament considered it and rejected it in a perfectly legitimate, if in your view, unwise way. There are people who say, oh, well, lots of people didn't vote. Well, actually, the turnout was very high. More people voted for Brexit than for anything in British history. People say, oh, well, lies were told. Well, I mean, if we were to cancel every general election because untruths were told or false promises were made, we'd be getting in very difficult terrain. I just ask those of you who voted Remain to consider the alternative could be worse. There's a huge disconnect with the public, and whether you like it or not, 17 million people did vote to leave. And if we suddenly just said, right, well, we're going to disregard that and just treat it as advisory or do it again or whatever, I think there would be a huge hostile public reaction. So I don't personally think that's credible or desirable. But, and I finish with this point, I think this is very important, it is perfectly compatible with saying, and I repeat, I accept the verdict and it should be implemented. Also to say, this is a lengthy and difficult process involving much negotiation across many countries, and Parliament absolutely has to be part of that process in terms both of opportunities to speak and debate and also of the chance to vote on motions before the House of Commons. And needless to say, without going any further than that, and I don't think I should go further than that, insofar as it is within the power or potential influence of the Speaker, legitimately and without partisanship, to try to ensure that Parliament has that proper role and that it is not disrespected, believe me, I will need no additional encouragement.
Okay, I want to take 3 more questions from this block on my left, and then I'm going to take 3 more questions from the block at the back, and then I'm going to have 3 more final questions from the people on the back tiers. So, quick questions, quick answers. So, come to the left. Questions here.
Thank you for making the effort to come up. It's a very quick and not very erudite question. Option 3, is anybody costed this, even roughly? And if so, what?
Touching on what you were saying earlier about facts and values, given the rise of potentially the gimmick of fact-checking both within the EU referendum and especially in the US election, what place would there be for live fact-checking in Parliament, and would it actually damage the quality of parliamentary debate if there were to be live fact-checking going on during parliamentary debates? Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, you've expanded a lot in your talk about the challenges facing Parliament as an institution in terms of architecture and realities. I wanted to ask what are your opinions on the other debate going on at the moment about things such as parliamentary reform, reform of the House of Lords, reform of the voting system, things like that, the other side of parliamentary change.
Thank you. Okay, projected cost at this stage of the third option, which I cautiously but clearly commended to you, circa £3 billion. So it's a lot of money. I don't think, to be honest, it's going to be possible to deliver such a massive project for less. The danger obviously exists that it will end up more. And if you ask me, am I bothered about that? The honest answer is I am bothered about that, because all history shows that government contracts tend to overrun in terms both of cost and of duration. And that does concern me. And just so that I'm not in any way coming to you under false pretenses, I must be honest and say that although I have commended to you, on balance, the idea that we should probably decant in one go, I wouldn't want to say that I've never had doubts about it. Indeed, I started as very much a skeptic about the idea of decant, partly because of a concern that the doctrine of the occupied field applies. If you're not occupying the field and someone else is, the danger is you might be off that field for rather longer than you thought or he or she promised. And I am concerned about that even now. I was also a bit concerned, with no disrespect to the professionalism of our officials, because some of those who were so keenly advocating that we get out were officials. And I couldn't help but feel that from their point of view, it would be frightfully convenient to have us politicians out of the way. And some of the people making the case, it didn't, frankly, particularly inspire confidence in me. So I was rather cautious about it. And I do have some concerns. But I think that if you do the underground tour of the Palace of Westminster, as I've done, and you see just how horrendous it is, you realise the magnitude of what is required. And I think in practical terms, for the reasons I gave, the alternatives are very likely to be worse. But we are talking about a cost of at least £3 billion. Secondly, what about fact-checking? Well, I think what I would say is I'm not in favour of Parliament itself establishing a fact-checking system, because whatever the attraction, you've got to think everything through when you undertake a change. And if we were to do so, and it were to be, in a sense, almost live streamed, you would effectively have Parliament as an institution evaluating individual contributions by individual members on different sides or on the same side while they were being made. And that, I think, frankly, is out of keeping with the principle that you have free speech, people make their case, and others listening to it can make their judgment on it. Forgive me, I'm slightly skeptical about the fact-checking lobby, because I think sometimes people who say, oh, but you know, it's outrageous because this argument's been made and they've got the facts wrong and they're misleading people. I slightly tend to think that this is a slightly elitist point, because I think that if you can see that bogus points that are factually untrue are being made to you, why do you make the assumption that other people can't also reach that conclusion? So I'm a bit wary of it, but if in what is, let's face it, an open marketplace with social networking sites all over the place, people want to establish fact-checking systems, that's fine by me. But I don't think that they should be given a gilded status or the imprimatur of Parliament. Thirdly, on wider reform, what do I think? Well, here I fear I will upset, well, I won't upset, I will probably attract the sort of benign sympathy of David Blunkett. I, historically, have been a supporter of a predominantly elected second chamber. And I don't think David has been. I think he takes a different view. However, I do think that the attempt in the last Parliament was massively mishandled, because those who wanted to insist that they wanted an elected second chamber, but that the Commons would still be the primary chamber, which a lot of people were worried it wouldn't be, thought that they could make that case by just saying, oh, well, we'll have a clause in the bill saying it will be the primary chamber. That was a huge mistake, if I may say so, by David Cameron and Nick Clegg. That didn't work. It seems to me that when you're thinking about Lords reform, you've got first to start by deciding on the delineation of powers and functions between the two chambers. You actually have to have a proper codification. If you don't have a proper codification, and the attempt at Lords reform in the last Parliament didn't have that, and you just got one clause saying, oh, notwithstanding that this bill is about having an elected, wholly or predominantly, second chamber, don't worry, the House of Commons will still remain the primary chamber. It was just a rhetorical reassurance. It wasn't going to convince anybody. Is Lords reform going to come in a big way anytime soon? No. And if you are a betting person, I would not encourage you to bet on the likelihood of an elected second chamber any time within the next decade. I think it is extremely unlikely. As to wider electoral reform, I'm open-minded about that, but I have to say I think these things are generally determined once a generation. And whether you like it or not, and it may be people in this room who would have preferred STV, single transferable vote, as the alternative to first past the post, there was a variant on the theme of electoral reform, namely AV, put to the electorate in May 2011, and it was trounced. So I don't think that will come back anytime soon. My own feeling is that where we should really seek reform is in hugely strengthening the capacity of MPs to scrutinise the executive, bolstering further our select committees, looking at how we can improve the evidence-taking process by bill committees, improving pre-legislative scrutiny and post-legislative scrutiny. I know they may not sound very sexy, they may not attract huge front-page coverage, but actually over a period, thought through well and done effectively, they can actually make our democratic process much, much, much more effective.
Okay, any questions from the back rows on the floor? Okay, yep, let's get some mics at the back.
While you're implementing option 3 for moving location while the building works take place, any chance of revitalising the whole of Parliament by going for option 3 plus option 4 and have an English devolved government to boost England and then be left with a rejuvenated UK Parliament?
Okay, somebody just in front of you. Yep. Then we need to get a mic right up. Oh, we've got one up there already. Great. Okay.
It's a simple one, this wasn't. It's about the education process, and it's whether or not you think that there's more that can be done to bring Parliament to the people as a whole. At the moment, the only thing we really have, apart from sort of BBC reporting, yesterday in Parliament and things, you get the situation of there's televised Parliament, which very, very few people, I understand, watch. Some of us do. But because it tends to be selective, it misses out on an awful lot of the good work. And you say the select committees, particularly checking bills and things, before it actually gets to the final adversarial debate, quite often, that's really the bit. If people understood how things were being done better, maybe is this a thing where we can use the internet better rather than look into the BBC, so that you could actually have virtually the entire process put out so that the public, not just the people who've actually managed to attend the House, can see things happening, but the rest of us up here, because it's not so easy. For those of us who used to work down there at times and we enjoyed that, but we don't get it now.
Thank you.
Okay, that was in danger of a mini lecture, but I think we got the question. Political education, how do we make it happen? Man up on the top.
Can you use your modest disciplinary powers to improve the atrocious attendance of MPs to some debates?
Okay, so question about an English Parliament, political education, and the apparently atrocious attendance of MPs.
I am not particularly enthusiastic about the idea of an English Parliament. I mean, if you're asking me, is it, a cri de coeur from my side? It isn't. Is it something that sort of beats in my breast? I think that there are dangers. We already have a thing now called English Votes for English Laws, which the government was very committed to introduce in this Parliament. I wasn't, I must say, particularly enthusiastic about being given the responsibility to certify bills or parts of bills as English only. Although so far it's proved relatively uncontroversial, it could potentially be quite controversial, and I don't myself think it's ideal for the Speaker to be given that role. So I did warn the government that if they intended to proceed in that way, you know, it was their prerogative, they had every right to do so, but they would have to rest content with my verdict. And I think the threshold of proof has to be pretty high. In other words, if in doubt, I wouldn't certify. So far, no great controversy has arisen, but as I say, I don't think it's an ideal starting point. Look, there could be an English Parliament if the House voted for one. I think we've got to try to remind ourselves of more of what it is that makes a parliament a parliament. I think the merit of a unitary parliament is very real for the country as a whole. I do understand the particular circumstances that prompted Scotland and Wales, nations within the United Kingdom, to want greater devolution. And I think on the whole that's worked pretty well. And of course there is devolution to Northern Ireland. But I would just point out that England is still very much the dominant player within the United Kingdom. And I think it's quite important not to allow ourselves to be seduced by those whose rhetoric would suggest that, you know, England is terribly suppressed and downtrodden and uninfluential and unfairly impoverished to the benefit of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I just don't think that's true. And, you know, I just think we've got to be a bit wary of the logic that says, well, we've got to have a separate one for this or for that. You might as well say, well, you know, let's have, and I don't want to encourage you, a separate parliament for Yorkshire. Well, no, I don't think that that is necessary. We've got perfectly good district or borough councils, and I think, you know, it's not desirable. I don't think we want constantly to be thinking of the separate. Let's try to think of what we can do together. And I don't personally think that there's a great need for an English Parliament. The second question about political education. Yes, I think that we could do more. I think there are two possible routes. One is to try to persuade BBC Parliament, which does do a good job, and you referred to it, but which isn't as well viewed as we'd like it to be, to embrace a more diverse range of products. And maybe we could look at whether we can say to them, we really must insist, as there's a reputational implication for us, as well as a broadcasting benefit to you in what you broadcast, that you broadcast a prescribed share of, for example, select committee proceedings or consideration by both houses of a bill before publication, say, because some of that would be fascinating stuff. And I certainly think if more of the select committee hearings were broadcast and people saw them more, our standing as a parliament would be higher. You won't be surprised to know that I think that the election of select committee chairs, which I think I referred to in passing, has brought about a great increase in the effectiveness of the select committees, which are doing a pretty good job anyway. But don't tell me there's no relationship between the democratic legitimacy those chairs have, having been elected by secret ballot of the whole House, and their greater assertiveness. In the last Parliament, to give just two examples, in a very speakily way, one from each side of the House, Andrew Tyree, the Treasury Select Committee Chair, and Margaret Hodge, the Public Accounts Committee Chair, were absolutely superb in holding government and often big corporates to account. And those chairs and their committees did brilliant work. And I think if they were more viewed, Parliament would be more highly respected. So using the BBC is one way. Another way is for us, to some extent, using technology to try to reach out into more communities, including into schools and colleges, to communicate what it is we do, what the build process is. We have a thing called the Outreach Service, and we do stage workshops all over the country. But I think that we could probably dramatically increase our effectiveness if, on top of the personal visits and the organised workshops, we could use technology to better effect. And the very last point I suppose I would make, and this goes back to Bernard Crick, is I am a huge believer in citizenship education in schools, which David embraced as a big cause as Secretary of State for Education. You know, sometimes British people say, I remember Ted Heath once said that he didn't think that the Americans were well educated. Well, I'm not going to get into that. Though obviously
Get into that. Go on.
I'm rather doubtful about how well-educated Donald Trump is, of course. But what I would say is a lot of American school children are familiar with the basic features of the American Constitution. And I feel, in a completely non-party political way, when school kids leave, they should have benefited not just from academic education in core subjects and others, not just from sex and relationship education, not just from education in basic financial literacy. They should have benefited from basic education in the rudiments of what a parliamentary democracy is. And I still think it's a big challenge to do far more on that front. I mean, I visit a huge number of schools, but, you know, when I say a huge number, I probably visit 20 schools a year outside my constituency and probably have a similar number coming in. But I'm scratching the surface.
And what are all the MPs doing all day because they're not in the chamber?
Yes, and I do want to challenge that, though. We're open to criticism in all sorts of ways. First of all, I have absolutely no disciplinary power, nor should the Speaker have power to tell people they've got to be in the chamber, other than in the sense that if they want to ask a question, they've got to be there at the start of that exchange. If they want to speak in a debate, they should be there at the start. And there are certain rules about having to be present for opening speeches and wind-up speeches and so on. And if those rules aren't complied with, the Speaker can either relegate people down the list or stop them speaking altogether. And I think most colleagues think that that's right and proper. Otherwise, people would just wander in, speak, leave, and that would be intolerable. But no, I mean, I think the answer to the point, sir, if I may say so, is, okay, now and again there may be a bad example of an important debate poorly attended, but I think it is quite important, and this is a challenge for us, to explain what MPs do. MPs sit in the chamber and ask questions and make speeches. MPs deal with correspondence and emails in their offices. MPs attend select committees. MPs attend public bill committees. MPs attend all-party parliamentary group meetings. MPs meet constituents either in Westminster or very nearby. MPs go to their constituencies during the day, sometimes in the evening. They have arrangements sometimes with their party where they have a period of days off to attend to important constituency matters and so on. So I think it's a great mistake to think that the role of an MP is to be sitting in a classroom. There are lots of different roles involved in being an MP. It's not all about being in the chamber. Some people are very keen attenders in and contributors in the chamber, but there are MPs who are working very hard even if they're not in the chamber. So, I mean, there are many legitimate criticisms of MPs, but I think it's a mistake to say, oh, well, you know, there's an important debate, why is my MP not in the chamber? Your MP might well be doing another parliamentary duty, and probably is.
Okay, we're going to finish up with a quick fire round. We have 2 minutes. I'm getting very hungry. I'm sure you're getting very hungry. Mr. Speaker has a long train ride back to London. So anybody have any burning questions they want to ask? And we're going to have very quick questions and very quick answers. Let's go for 5. Yep. So I've got one man here, somebody at the back side, the bright lights. So I can see a hand up. They've got a hand up over here. We haven't had many from the top tier.
We haven't had many women.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a woman there.
There's a woman there. There's more than that woman. There's a few more. Anybody? Okay, so let's try and go across. Have we got any set up?
Hi there. It's more about the ritual that is involved with Parliament and how much the buildings are part of that. And if you move, will those rituals be carried across or not?
Okay. Take that one as we prepare for the next.
Well, I mean, we could preserve the rituals if we moved, and I think some of them must be preserved. I happen to think, even if people don't understand it, the arrangement whereby Black Rod has to bang on the door of the House of Commons to secure admittance on the day of the state opening is a very important reminder of the parliamentary struggle against an absolute monarchy. It may not be understood by everybody, but it's precious, and it's very much a part of why we're here and what we do.
When you talk about the issue of political education, and one being the distance that Westminster is from the people, do you not feel it's quite ironic that the Education Centre for Parliament is in London and further away from the people than it should be?
I see that point, and let me just say to you, we've got an education centre in London. At the risk of causing controversy in some quarters, I don't think we should rule out the possibility of another education centre elsewhere in the country. And so, yes, I see your point. I don't think it's a conclusive criticism that it's where it is, but is there a good case for having another, perhaps in the north of England? I think there could be. And I think now, at the time of restoration and renewal, would be the occasion to bite the bullet.
Got any idea where you might put it?
Yes, I could be the complete populist. I've got a feeling if I said Sheffield, it would be hugely popular in this audience.
Okay, Manfred.
Can you confirm you did vote in the EU referendum?
I can. I did.
That's quick fire. Lady from the back. Yeah.
So who's going to make the decision about what happens to Parliament? Will it be a democratic decision? Will it be Parliament? Will it be us? Will it be the government? And when's it all going to happen?
Very good question. Who will make the decision on restoration and renewal? Answer: the House of Commons. There will be a debate on the Joint Committee's report, and that debate is likely to be in November. At the very latest, it should be in December, but I hope in November. And the House will have an opportunity to vote. Whether there will be a need for subsequent debates and votes, I don't know. But it's something that has to be determined by the House, not by the government, and certainly not by the Speaker.
Okay, we can have this man here, and then a lady over there, and then we're going to wrap up.
Does being Speaker of the House confer any advantage on your constituents?
Does being Speaker of the House confer any advantage on constituents? I think I would say I get speedier and fuller replies from more senior ministers since becoming Speaker than I got before. I first found this in 2009, and actually the best, Ed Miliband, Ed Balls were very good, the best was actually Jack Straw. And I commented to my private secretary that I was much impressed. I was getting all these replies from Jack, who was Justice Secretary, very full, very quick. And he said, "Oh, no surprise about that, Mr. Speaker. It's a great mark of shame if a Secretary of State so hacks off the Speaker that the Speaker demands to see the Secretary of State to complain." So I rather loosely said, "Oh, I see, if I'm annoyed with Jack, I go and remonstrate with him at the Ministry of Justice, do I?" To which Angus replied, "No, Mr. Speaker, in those circumstances, you don't go to the Ministry of Justice to see Mr. Secretary Straw. Mr. Secretary Straw comes to Speaker's house to see you for a meeting without coffee."
Should I just explain the question maybe? The convention is that in the Speaker's constituency, the other parties don't contest. So if you live in Buckingham, you have one option. But what better option might you want? Yeah, that's
well, no, okay, very briefly, because it is an important point. It actually often comes up in question time session, you know, the convention relating to the Speaker. That was a sort of slightly flippant answer. And by the way, I ought to say, and I don't say this in any spirit of false modesty, I'm not important. I'm not important at all. Other than obviously I hope to my family. But the office of Speaker is important, and in recognition of the historic character of the office, on the one hand, and of the fact that the Speaker can't speak in debates or table motions or vote unless there's a tie, and there hasn't been a tie in the House of Commons since 1993, the Speaker gets a deluxe service from the government. However, it is often said, including by some people in Buckingham, my constituency, who are not happy about it, well, it's all very well, John, you being Speaker, but we don't get a party choice here in Buckingham, because you stand as the Speaker seeking re-election. There are a couple of minor candidates, perhaps. I had a UKIP opponent and a Green opponent, but no Labour, Liberal Democrat or Conservative candidates standing. And some people don't like that. It is an imperfect system, but the reason why it isn't changed, and I don't think it will be, the House looked at it, or the Procedure Committee looked at it in the last Parliament, is that the House basically wants the Speaker to be a constituency MP who has some of the same pressures and responsibilities as they have, but they don't want him to be quite like them. They don't want the Speaker to face major party competition because they want the Speaker to get back into Parliament. And so that's why there is this convention the major parties don't put up against the Speaker. The alternative often canvassed to having a special separate seat for the Speaker called St. Stephen's, named after the St. Stephen's entrance to the House, which would be a rotten borough, is, if I may say so, in my view, a considerably worse alternative. So it's easy to point to the weaknesses of the status quo, but it's rather difficult to point to something better.
Okay, final question, please.
A couple of years ago, I had the privilege of coming to Parliament and the Speaker's House for International Women's Day. And so I'm quite interested in the report that is looking to make Parliament more female-friendly. And I was wondering if there's a really quick-fire bullet point format of saying how you're going to try and make Parliament more female-friendly in the renewals.
Well, I'll give you one example. I think it would be really good if all of our major committees had adequate female representation on them. There are too many committees even now in Parliament that don't. That's one good example. I still want to see much greater representation of women in senior positions in the House service, that is to say, senior staff in the House, and I've done my best on that front. So those would be two examples. We've got a long way to go, but I admit that I am proud that I did appoint, ladies and gentlemen, the first female and the first BME Speaker's Chaplain, the Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, in the history of the House of Commons. I did appoint the first BME Sergeant-at-Arms in the history of the House of Commons, who took up post in February, Mohammed Al-Hajji. And I did appoint the first female and minority ethnic Speakers Council, the senior lawyer who advises me and the House. I think that, if we did nothing, if we just left it to the traditional ways of doing things, then, forgive me saying so, but particularly in some key departments, you'd still have an even heavier representation of white upper middle class men on the what I call bloody good man principle. And when I was elected Speaker, about 6 months later, I'm not going to say who this was, but about 6 months after I was elected Speaker, one of my senior colleagues came up to me in the chair and he said to me, Mr. Speaker, he said, you were very hesitant, but he said, I didn't vote for you. I didn't vote for you. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to work this out. I didn't vote for you. I didn't vote for you. I voted for Sir George Young because I think he's a bloody good egg. But if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, he said, I think we're doing jolly well. If I may say so, I think we're doing jolly well. Well done, well done. He said, I'd just like to make one point. Can I make my point? And I said, yes, please do make your point. And he said to me, Mr. Speaker, I don't understand this outreach business, this business of you sort of visiting schools and colleges and sort of universities and so forth. He said, and I said, what's the matter? And he said, it's a rum business, he said. It's a rum business. And he said, Mr. Speaker, I do have very considerable experience with this place. My family have got very, very long association with this house, as you know. And I said, yes, indeed, I'm well aware of that, but what's your point? And he said, well, not to put too fine a point on it, I think it's rather below stairs. He said, it's rather beneath the dignity of the office. If people want to know what the Speaker does, they bloody well come to the House of Commons and watch the Speaker at work. But I really think somebody who occupies your very, very high office, Mr. Speaker, is way beneath the dignity of the office to go around sort of visiting schools and universities and so forth. I think it's a poor show, And so I said to him, well, I respect your honesty, but forgive me saying so, I do respect your honesty, but forgive me saying so, I think your view is completely out of date. And let's finish on the note of renewal and modernisation. Totally out of date. It's based on a very old-fashioned idea that we can just look important, dress up in some fancy uniform and be completely inaccessible to the outside world, and people will respect us. I'm a paid public servant, and I think I should be an articulate advocate for Parliament and a robust ambassador for the place, somebody who tries to get out there, talk to and hear from the electorate. So, thank you for being honest, but I'm afraid we'll just have to agree to differ.